Today I want to talk about some tech that I used to think was really hard, which I've recently come around to find is actually not that bad. And the first one of these is going to be Postgres/SQL. When I started doing web development, it was about 4 years ago. You guys have to understand, I'm 22 years old, so I haven't been doing this that long. I'm still really figuring this out as I go. That's a lot of what this channel is. One of the things that I've been doing from the beginning was crutching really hard on ORMs. When I was learning, the ORM of choice for me was Prisma, and I leaned really hard on this for a long time, to the point where conceptually, of course, I understood the underlying SQL. You have to if you're using an ORM, at least to some degree if you're using an ORM. I understood how the relations worked. I understood how the data models work and all that stuff. If you wanted me to write like a normal select or insert statement, or God forbid a join statement, I would not be able to do it. Certainly not off the dome, maybe with a little bit of help from like an LLM or Google searching, but I really didn't deeply understand it because I figured the ORM made it a lot easier to just abstract that away, and I didn't have to think about it that much. But recently, that's kind of changed for me with Drizzle. I initially picked up Drizzle just because it was like Prisma, just lighter weight. I think these days that's one of the biggest problems Prisma is really facing, is it's just if you want to get Prisma set up and working in your project, you have to set up the big Prisma schema file, you have to load in the Prisma binary, you have to run all their different things, versus with Drizzle, it really is just adding a schema.ts file, writing some TypeScript code, and then importing those type definitions into your project. It feels a lot lighter and a lot cleaner, and it's a lot more pleasant to work with, which I think is part of why they're winning so hard right now. And that's why I initially switched to them, but the Trojan horse of Drizzle is they actually kind of tricked me into learning SQL. Supabase had a lot to do with this as well, because if you've seen any of the local development experience of Supabase, they basically just give you a full local containerized version of their suite, but Supabase is just Postgres. Their whole entire thing is they're just building useful UI and features on top of Postgres, which you can kind of hook into and use in your application. And the fact that it is just Postgres has meant that I've had to actually look at and learn about Postgres to get it working. And one of the things that I really think is so good about these tools together, Drizzle and Supabase, is that they've effectively taught me about their underlying abstraction. I think it's really cool that Drizzle has effectively forced me to learn how to do joins, to learn how to do correct insert statements and select statements and do all these things to make my SQL correct, to the point where when I've had to do a bunch of Python work lately for Insider Viz data analysis backend work type things, we have to do a lot of data science in there. I've been super comfortable just writing the raw SQL into our database and getting all this stuff done, and I very quickly realized that this is not actually that difficult of a piece of tech. Now, again, I think this is going to be a theme through this entire video. The question really is, does it feel easy now just because I have more experience, I've seen more things, I have more mental context, so naturally it's going to be easier? Or is it just that we really don't need these abstractions and from day zero you can go in and do those things? I think I am far enough away from the true beginner phase that I honestly can't say, because I do remember looking back a couple years, especially when I was like really new, like in the 2022 range, like around the time when T3 Stack was first releasing and all that stuff. You know, I really benefited from having Prisma and all that stuff. I was not super comfortable with how everything worked underneath. I really kind of had to live in that abstraction land, which is, of course, a skill issues thing, as I'm sure you're commenting right now. But, you know, it also allowed me to ship stuff and make things happen at that age with that level of experience. So I don't know, it goes back and forth. Another one I wanted to mention in this video was going to be Linux. I have Linux dual booted on my desktop PC, and what I actually want to talk about with Linux is this is really the $5 VPS stand-in. The ability to just kind of get an EC2 instance in the cloud, download your code, install whatever packages you need, whatever runtimes you need, start up your server, stick an Nginx instance in front of it, whitelist some IPs, and get an application running. I remember trying this a couple years ago when I was really new and having an absolute nightmare of a time trying to get it done. Admittedly, I was trying to host PHP back then, and this was in high school, and I really had no idea what was going on, so my perception of it was kind of warped, and that was kind of the perception that I just kept for a while, and I really tried to avoid doing stuff like that for a long time, until I tried it again recently, and it was really easy. Now, I have Linux dual booted on my desktop. I'm using Mac OS. I heavily use the terminal. I'm a developer, so obviously Linux, it shouldn't actually be that hard. And once you kind of get into it, you realize that these $5 VPS things, yeah, they are pretty simple. My problem with them honestly doesn't lie in the fact that they're too difficult. I just think that a lot of the normal day-to-day things for your application, it's just easier to deal with it in like a serverless land because there's things you just don't have to think about when you're architecting it that way. And that brings me to another piece I have on here, which is AWS. Now, when I first started doing web development a couple of years ago, like pre T3 stack days, like back in 2021, 2020 ranges, I actually wanted to go straight into the big cloud providers. I sort of looked at all these things and I'm like, oh, it makes a ton of sense for me to just go ahead and do everything in AWS or GCP or Azure. And being the naive, silly little child I was, I chose GCP and I tried building my applications into GCP. I remember there was one Next.js site I was working on. It was like my freshman year of college. I built out this whole thing. It had like a giant GraphQL backend that was hosted separately, and it had all this random crap inside of it. That I think someday I want to go through that code base because it's a monstrosity, but it's a beautiful monstrosity. And I was trying to host that on GCP. And when I finally got it working, it like took 15 seconds to load because I configured something wrong. I was trying to use their app engine or something like that. I don't know exactly what it was, but the entire thing was a hellish nightmare that did not work out. And eventually I think I just ended up hosting it on Netlify and it was totally fine, worked out. But that pretty much soured me on the whole using the underlying cloud providers thing. I basically avoided it for many years until recently. For Insider Viz, we've had to do some more complicated backend stuff. So we've been trying out the whole system of leaning really hard into AWS. If you're on X at all, you've almost certainly seen like posts from Dax talking about SST and the whole idea of baking your application deeply into your infrastructure. There's a lot of things we need to do for Insider Viz that involve background jobs, queues, very distributed systems-y type things to just get our processing system working. I unfortunately can't go super deep into it on video. That's kind of when we're getting into like the really important stuff that I really can't talk about publicly. But suffice to say, we're doing some really dope stuff with lambdas and SQS queues and S3 buckets to the point where like I am really enjoying the AWS experience, and the things we're able to build with it are really, really sick. But it feels really good to work with. And like I said, it's really actually not that difficult. I think GCP just sucks. I wouldn't recommend it at all. But AWS, from my experience, the lambdas are really nice to work with. The queues are really nice to work with. S3 is pretty solid to work with. It's not great. It has some rough edges, but I mean, it works. It's object storage. One thing I found to actually be pretty disappointing is the RDS instances. They are extremely expensive and they don't feel that great. Like the experience I get from for Insider Viz, we're paying like $300 a month for an RDS instance to handle all of our forms because we have to do heavy data science over them, and we have all of the SEC's data for a long, long time. So we have, I want to say, it's in the tens of millions of rows. So it's an enormous database. And well, I guess it's not enormous because there are databases with petabytes worth of data, but at least, for me, it's a huge database. But man, the experience just kind of sucks. I have not loved it. That's one thing where like I've been trying to cut how many cloud providers I'm using. I was for a long time kind of in the like use a SaaS for everything type mindset, and I've kind of found myself moving more and more away from that and just trying to keep things simpler. That's part of my love for SvelteKit. I think that's kind of the JS framework that best embodies that. And also for the services I'm using, really, I'm trying to do most things in AWS, but there's a couple things that I think just don't really fit in here. One of them is like the database. Like I said, I've not liked RDS at all. I'm much happier using Supabase, and I think I'm going to keep using that. I think Upstash is really nice for like a Redis store and also a vector store. They just have some features that really don't exist here yet, at least to my knowledge and understanding. So I'm going to stick with that for a while. And then having something like a Cloudinary for image management and object storage. Again, S3 is usable. It's not terrible, but especially when you're trying to manage a bunch of content on the website, it just feels a lot nicer to do that through like a Cloudinary portal or something like that. But outside of those things, but like I said, I found AWS to be a lot less painful than I expected, and I'll have more videos in the future talking about how I'm really using this, and I think it's worth trying out. It's not the horrific nightmare they say it is. It's tough, but it's not impossible. And then finally, the last one here I wanted to talk about is OAuth 2.0. I know this is kind of a weird random one. I don't want to get into the like, should you roll your own auth debate thing here. For like Insider Viz, we don't. We use Supabase auth, and I think it totally makes sense to use an auth provider. What I'm actually talking about here is the more complicated pieces of OAuth, specifically using it to access some other API other than just logging a user in. In this case, for me, it's the block backend to get calendar syncing working with Google Calendar. I initially had to use Clerk to get that working at all in order to get the access tokens working, to handle the refresh tokens. I would basically use their SDKs for everything. And that ended up feeling pretty heavy and bloated and not great. And I kind of had to, every time I was doing some backend work, I had to think about, oh, wait, how am I going to get this to work with Clerk? And how am I going to get my requests to work with Clerk? And how am I going to do all these things and wrap it into their system? And I ended up just really, really not loving it. So I ended up basically going through and trying to rewrite this from scratch and just doing it custom and just making it so that I can pass my own bearer tokens up and down in headers in a way that's just simple and makes sense. And the experience was actually not that difficult. And I do think, I promise guys, I am not trying to be an AI shitfluencer here. I know I've talked about it a lot, but it's an important technology. There's a lot of good stuff there. And I think this is an important thing to talk about, which is the fact that I was really able to implement this because of having an LLM as a much more powerful docs source. I basically just went into Claude 3.5 and was able to go through and generate out all the code and work out all the rough edges of implementing the OAuth that I needed to fetch calendars down. And it's working really well. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you don't really understand what's going on underneath. For me, the bottleneck wasn't understanding conceptually what was going on. I get how OAuth works, the callbacks, the codes, all that stuff. It's not that complicated at all. A lot of the problem for me is just like, what's the actual syntax for this? What Google library do I need to import here? What do I need to do with this and that? The documentation for this stuff isn't great and it's kind of hard to do, but the LLMs kind of make it so that these things that were a huge pain in the ass even a year ago are now a lot more achievable and understandable for most people. At least for me, I think this OAuth situation is one of the best examples of the fact that these LLMs can take these really obtuse and obnoxious problems and make them much more approachable and doable. That's really all I wanted to talk about here. I know kind of went all over the place, but really the point here is that the underlying technologies on a lot of this stuff are not quite as difficult as you probably think they are, and a lot of these are very much worth learning. I'm still figuring out where I stand on all this stuff, but for right now, I think this pretty much clarifies where I am. And hopefully, if you haven't done it yet, go give some of these a shot. It's really not that bad. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will talk to you soon.